My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 41 years old when the world ended, and 42 when I started walking toward the sea. I'm telling you this because someone should know what happened at the Lighthouse on Cape Morrow, and because the signal I found there changed what I believed about everything, about the dead, about the living, about the particular kind of silence that sits between a man and the family he cannot find. Before I get to the Lighthouse, you need to understand what I was before. I was a surveyor for the Oregon Department of Transportation. I mapped roads. I measured the distances between things that mattered: bridges and intersections, grades and drainage culverts. I knew the coastal highways of this state the way a surgeon knows the veins of a body. Every curve, every washout zone, every place the land wanted to slide into the ocean. That knowledge kept me alive longer than courage or strength ever could have. Because when the roads became death traps, I knew which ones still had a chance of being passable, and which ones had already been surrendered to gravity and neglect long before the dead started walking. My wife's name is Sarah. My daughter's name is Ellie. She was 14 when the outbreak started, and she would be 15 now if she is still alive. I say is and not was because I have no proof of their death. And in the absence of proof, I have chosen belief, which is the only currency that still holds any value in a world where everything else has been debased. They were visiting Sarah's mother in Astoria when the communications went dark. I was in Salem, finishing a survey report that no one would ever read. The last text message I received from Sarah said, "Trying to get to the school, phone almost dead. I love you. Find us." That was September 14th. I have read that message so many times that the cracked screen of my dead phone feels like scripture to me. A text I carry not because it functions, but because it testifies. I spent the first 3 months of the collapse trying to reach Astoria by the obvious routes. Highway 30 was impassable within the first 2 weeks. A tractor-trailer jackknifed near Rainier had created a blockage that attracted infected by the hundreds, and by the time I got there, the entire corridor was a feeding ground. Highway 26 through the Coast Range was better for a while, but the tunnel near Elsie had been deliberately collapsed by someone. Military, militia, I never learned which. And the detours through logging roads added days of exposure I couldn't afford. I tried twice and was turned back both times, once by terrain and once by a group of armed survivors near Jewel who made it clear that westbound travelers were not welcome. They weren't cruel about it. The man who spoke to me had the exhausted decency of someone who had already made harder refusals than mine. He told me the coast was gone. He told me Astoria had burned. He told me to go east, where the population density was lower and the infected were thinner on the ground. I didn't go east. I went south along the interior valleys, scavenging and moving, and then cut west again toward the coast near Lincoln City. My plan, if you could call it a plan, was to work my way north along the coastline, checking every town and settlement for signs of organized survival, for refugee camps, for any trace of Sarah and Ellie. It was not a good plan. It was the only plan available to a man whose sole remaining purpose was the search itself. I acquired the radio in Newport from the body of a woman who had died in a sporting goods store. She had barricaded herself in the back office and survived long enough to set up a small communications station. A Baofeng handheld, a longer-range base unit that looked like modified ham equipment, a solar panel wired through the window. She had been dead for weeks when I found her, and the cause appeared to be a wound on her leg that had gone septic. Not a bite, just an ordinary cut, the kind of injury that would have meant a tetanus shot and a bandage in the old world, transformed by the absence of antibiotics into a death sentence. I buried her behind the store because it seemed like the right thing to do
and because the act of digging reminded me that I was still capable of effort that served no survival purpose. I took her radio equipment, and I have carried it since. The base unit was too heavy to carry indefinitely, but the handheld became my companion. Every night, wherever I sheltered, I would scan frequencies. Most were dead.
Some carried automated emergency broadcasts that had been repeating unchanged since the first weeks. FEMA messages about evacuation routes that no longer existed. Coast Guard channels cycling through protocols for a response infrastructure that had dissolved. Occasionally, I caught fragments of live transmissions. Survivors talking to each other in clipped, cautious exchanges. Coordinates shared in code. Warnings about infected concentrations. Pleas that went unanswered. I listened to all of it, and I transmitted rarely. Because broadcasting your position in a world of predators, living and dead, is a calculated risk. And I had learned to calculate. It was on the 47th night of my coastal journey, sheltering in a beachside vacation rental near Oceanside, that I first heard the Lighthouse signal. I had scanned past it initially, mistaking it for another automated loop. But something made me stop and go back. The signal was faint, buried under static, repeating at intervals of approximately 90 seconds. When I adjusted the squelch and pressed the speaker against my ear in the darkness, I could hear it clearly enough to transcribe. A woman's voice, flat and controlled, reading a message that went, "This is Cape Morrow Light. Survivors present. Fresh water available. Signal fire maintained at dusk. Approach from the south beach at low tide. Repeat." Then silence for 90 seconds. Then the message again. Cape Morrow. I knew the name. It was a decommissioned lighthouse about 30 miles north of my position, perched on a basalt headland that jutted into the Pacific like a fist. The lighthouse had been automated in the 1990s and deactivated entirely around 2010, its function replaced by GPS and modern navigation systems. The structure itself had been maintained as a historical site. I had visited it once with Sarah and Ellie years ago, on one of those coastal weekend trips that seemed so ordinary at the time and now felt like memories of paradise. Ellie had been 9 or 10. She had counted the stairs to the top. 147. She had been so proud of that number. I lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the signal repeat. There were reasons not to go. 30 miles of coastal terrain that I knew to be degraded and dangerous. The possibility that the signal was old, recorded weeks or months ago by survivors who had since moved on or died. The possibility that it was a trap. I had heard stories from other travelers about lures, false distress calls set up by people who had decided that other survivors were more useful as resources than as neighbors. And the possibility that it was simply an automated system running on residual power. A ghost voice speaking to an empty frequency. But there were reasons to go. Fresh water. Other survivors. A defensible, elevated position. And something else that I couldn't articulate cleanly, but that lived in my chest like a small, stubborn flame. The woman's voice sounded real. Not recorded real, but present real. There was a quality to it, a slight unevenness, a catch between survivors and present, that suggested a living person reading from a script she had written herself. I have spent enough hours listening to recorded emergency messages to know the difference between a voice that was captured and preserved and a voice that is being produced in the moment. This one felt alive. I left at first light. The first 12 miles were manageable. The coast road south of Tillamook had been damaged by landslides in several places, but my years of survey work let me read the terrain accurately enough to find passages. I moved through the town of Netarts without incident. It had been small before the collapse and was simply empty now. A scattering of vacation homes and crab shacks slowly returning to the salt and wind. The infected I encountered were few and sluggish, the cold coastal air seeming to slow them the way it slows everything organic. I avoided them easily by keeping to the beach when the road failed, and returning to the road when the tide pushed me inland. The trouble began around mile 13, near the remnants of a town called Ocean View that had been built along a narrow strip between the highway and a steep coastal bluff. Someone had tried to fortify it. I could see the evidence as I approached. Vehicles pushed into barricade lines across the road, sheets of plywood and corrugated metal nailed over windows, a trench dug across the highway that had since filled with rainwater and become a stagnant moat. The fortification had failed. The barricades were breached in multiple places. The plywood splintered outward from the inside in a pattern I had learned to recognize. Not forced entry from without, but panicked exit from within, which meant the infection had started inside the perimeter, as it always did eventually. Someone had turned. Someone always turned. I skirted the fortification to the west, dropping down to the beach below the bluff, and that was where I found the first signs of recent passage. Footprints in the wet sand above the tide line. Multiple sets, different sizes, some deep enough to suggest heavy packs. They were headed north, my direction. They were fresh enough that the last high tide hadn't erased them, which meant they were less than 12 hours old. This changed my calculations. Other survivors moving north along the coast meant either that they had heard the same signal I had, or that they knew something about Cape Morrow that I didn't. It also meant that whatever I found at the lighthouse, I might not find it alone. I couldn't decide if this was comforting or threatening. Both, probably. That was the permanent condition of encountering other people now. The simultaneous pull of hope and suspicion. The exhausting need to perform threat assessment on every human face, when all you really wanted was to trust someone. I increased my pace. By late afternoon, I had covered 22 miles, and my body was reminding me that distance is not merely a number on a map, but a physical experience that accumulates in the joints and tendons. I stopped to rest in the shell of a gas station that had been stripped of everything portable. While I ate a portion of my dwindling food supply, canned peas and a handful of stale crackers, I powered on the handheld and scanned for the signal. It was stronger now, clearer. The same voice, the same message, the same 90-second interval. But as I listened through several cycles, I noticed something I hadn't caught before. The background sound changed slightly between repetitions. In one cycle, I could hear wind. In the next, a faint metallic creak, like a door moving on old hinges. In the next, something that might have been footsteps. These ambient variations confirmed what I had suspected. This was not a recording on a loop. This was a live broadcast being repeated manually by a person who was sitting at a microphone and reading the same message over and over, hour after hour, into the void. Someone was at Cape Morrow. Someone was waiting. I pushed on through the remaining daylight and into the blue half-dark of coastal twilight. The terrain grew worse. The highway had been undermined by erosion in long sections. Whole lanes crumbled away into the surf below, leaving ribbons of asphalt that tilted seaward at angles that made walking treacherous. I moved slowly, testing each step, using the surveyor's instinct that had been trained into me over 15 years of field work. A road that looks solid can be hollow underneath. A surface that holds your weight on the first step can give way on the second. Trust your eyes, but verify with your feet. At dusk, I saw the signal fire. It was distant, perhaps 5 miles north along the coast, a point of orange light high on what I knew must be the Cape Morrow headland. Visible for miles in every direction to anyone with eyes to see it. A beacon, an invitation, or a trap. The woman on the radio had said, Signal fire maintained at dusk, and there it was, exactly as promised, which was either evidence of reliability or evidence of meticulous bait. I made a decision that I still cannot fully justify. Instead of stopping for the night, which would have been the prudent choice, I kept moving. 5 miles in the dark, through terrain I hadn't scouted, with infected potentially between me and the headland. It was reckless. But the fire pulled me forward the way a current pulls a swimmer. Not with force, but with the simple physics of moving toward the place where the energy is flowing. I wanted to be there. I wanted to see who was behind that voice. I wanted, if I am honest with myself, to not spend another night alone. The last 5 miles took me nearly 4 hours. The road disintegrated entirely about 2 miles south of the headland, giving way to a jumble of broken concrete and mudslide debris that forced me onto the beach. The tide was coming in, narrowing the sand to a strip barely wide enough to walk, and the rocks offshore created a confusion of surf noise that masked other sounds. I couldn't hear if anything was moving in the darkness above me on the bluff. I couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction. I had my flashlight, but I kept it off, preferring blindness to advertisement. I moved by feel and by the sound of the waves, keeping the ocean to my left and the bluff to my right, trusting the geometry of coastline to deliver me forward. I smelled them before I saw them. The infected have a smell. Everyone who has encountered them knows this, but I'll describe it for the record because records should be specific. It isn't the smell of decomposition exactly, though that's part of it. It's sweeter than rot, and there's a chemical edge to it, something almost metallic, as if the infection itself has an odor independent of the body it occupies. In cold air, the smell is muted but distinct, and on this night, with the wind coming off the ocean, I caught it in a pocket of still air near the base of the bluff where a shallow sea cave created a windbreak. I froze. I controlled my breathing. I listened. Movement in the cave, wet sounds, shuffling, the scrape of bare skin on rock. Something that might have been breathing, or might have been the rhythmic motion of a body that no longer needed to breathe, but still performed the mechanical action. I couldn't tell how many. The cave opening was a dark mouth in the darker bluff, maybe 20 feet from where I stood on the sand. I had weapons. A hatchet on my belt, reliable and quiet. A .38 revolver with 11 rounds remaining, loud, and therefore a last resort. I had learned, as everyone who survives learns, that noise is the real enemy. 1 shot brings 10 infected, and 10 bring 100. And 100 make a sound that brings everything within a mile radius converging on your position with the mindless persistence of water flowing downhill. I chose to go around. I waded into the surf up to my thighs, gasping at the cold, and moved past the cave mouth with the waves providing cover noise. The salt water soaked my pack and my boots and my lower body, and the cold was immediate and severe. But I was past the cave in 2 minutes and back on dry sand 50 yards north without incident. Behind me, the sounds from the cave continued undisturbed. They hadn't detected me. I was shaking with cold and adrenaline when I reached the base of the Cape Morrow headland. The bluff rose steeply here, and I could see the signal fire above me. Not the fire itself, but the glow it cast on the underside of the low clouds. A diffuse orange warmth that looked, from below, like a sunrise in the wrong direction. There was a path. Concrete steps, old and cracked, built into the bluff face decades ago for tourists visiting the lighthouse. Many of the steps were broken or missing, and the handrail was gone entirely in places. But the route was navigable. I climbed slowly, favoring my right knee, which had been unreliable since a fall near Depot Bay 3 weeks earlier. And as I climbed, the wind increased, and the sound of the surf below faded, and the smell of wood smoke replaced the smell of salt. At the top of the steps I found a gate, Chain link, 6 feet high, topped with concertina wire that glinted in the firelight. The gate was closed, but not locked. A heavy chain was wrapped around the post, but secured only with a carabiner clip, not a padlock. Easy to open from outside. This struck me as significant. A locked gate says, "Stay out." An unlocked gate says, "Come in, but on our terms." It was a choice presented as a barrier, and I understood the psychology of it. Anyone who reached this point had already demonstrated enough capability and determination to be worth admitting, and the unlocked gate told them they were expected. I opened the gate, stepped through, and closed it behind me. The Cape Morrow Lighthouse stood against the sky like a white finger pointing at nothing. It was shorter than I remembered, perhaps 60 feet to the lantern room, but my memory was filtered through Ellie's wonder, and everything is taller when you're 9 years old. The attached keeper's quarters, a 2-story clapboard building connected to the tower by an enclosed walkway, showed lights in 2 lower windows. Not electric light, the warm, unsteady flicker of candles or oil lamps. The signal fire burned in a steel drum on the concrete apron in front of the tower, well maintained, throwing enough light to illuminate the entire compound. I stood in the firelight and waited. I didn't approach the building. I didn't call out. I let myself be seen. This was protocol I had developed through months of encountering other survivors. Make yourself visible. Demonstrate that you have no ambition to sneak or surprise. Let them come to you on their ground and their timeline. Patience is the vocabulary of trust when words aren't yet possible. The door of the keeper's quarters opened. A woman stepped out. She was perhaps 50, lean, with short gray hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from years of outdoor work. She held a hunting rifle across her body, not aimed at me, but present, communicating the same bilingual message as the gate, welcome and warning simultaneously. She looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. "You heard the signal," she said, not a question. "Yes." "How far?" "About 30 miles south, Oceanside." She nodded, as though this confirmed a calculation she had already made. "I'm Vivian Cross. I keep the light." "Daniel Mercer. I'm looking for my family." Something shifted in her face when I said that. Not pity exactly. Pity had been used up early in the collapse, spent like cheap currency. But recognition. She had heard those words before. She had probably said them herself once. She lowered the rifle's angle slightly, a gesture so small it might have been unconscious, and said, "Come inside. We'll talk." The interior of the keeper's quarters was organized with the kind of disciplined efficiency that told me Vivian Cross had been surviving here not for days or weeks, but for months. The ground floor had been converted into a functional living space. A wood stove vented through a modified chimney provided heat, rain catchment barrels lined one wall, and food stores were arranged on shelves by category and labeled with dates in neat handwriting. A radio setup occupied a desk near the window, more sophisticated than anything I'd seen since the collapse, with what looked like a marine band transceiver, the ham equipment I'd been receiving, and a car battery connected to a solar charging system. This was the source of the signal. This was where the voice lived. There were others. A man in his 30s sat at a table cleaning a disassembled shotgun with the focused attention of someone performing a ritual rather than a task. He looked up when I entered, and his eyes performed the rapid assessment that had become the universal greeting. Checking my hands, my belt line, my eyes, the way I moved, trying to determine in 3 seconds whether I was a threat, an asset, or a burden. He seemed to reach an acceptable conclusion because he nodded once and returned to his work. "That's Liam," Vivian said. "He arrived 2 weeks ago." In the corner, On a makeshift bed of folded blankets and sleeping bags, a young woman sat with her knees drawn up and a paperback book open in her lap. She was younger than the others, early 20s, dark-haired, with a watchfulness that spoke of sustained fear. She didn't look up when I entered. "That's Rose. She was here when I arrived." "When was that?" I asked. 5 months ago, October." "And Rose?" "Rose doesn't say when she got here. Rose doesn't say much." Vivian's tone was matter-of-fact, neither concerned nor dismissive. Rose's silence was simply a condition of the environment, like the wind or the cold. Vivian sat me at the table and poured hot water from a kettle on the wood stove. Not tea, there was no tea. But the warmth itself was a luxury that loosened something in my chest I hadn't known was clenched. She let me drink before she started talking, which I appreciated. There is a generosity in allowing someone to be warm before asking them questions, and Vivian understood this. She told me her story in the compressed, unsentimental style that survivors develop. Not because they don't feel, but because feeling takes energy, and energy must be rationed like everything else. She had been a marine biologist at the Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport. When the outbreak reached the coast, the center had briefly become a refuge, fenced, institutional, stocked with supplies. But it had fallen in the first month. The usual pattern. Too many people, not enough organization, infection getting inside. Vivian had escaped north along the coast with a small group that dwindled through attrition until she was alone. She found Cape Morrow in October, found it defensible, found the radio equipment left behind by the last Coast Guard caretaker, and began broadcasting. "Why?" I asked. "Because a lighthouse is supposed to send signals," she said. "That's what it's for." I wanted to press further, to ask whether she was trying to build something or just refusing to disappear. But I recognized in her answer the kind of foundational statement that doesn't benefit from interrogation. She kept the light because it was a light. She sent the signal because the equipment existed and she knew how to use it. In a world that had lost its functions, she had found a structure whose function she could restore. And that restoration had become her reason. I understood this more deeply than I could express, because my own search for Sarah and Ellie operated on the same principle. Not because I had evidence of their survival, but because the search itself was the structure that kept me functional. I told Vivian about my family. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. When I finished, she said, "We've had other people come through. 11 since I started broadcasting. Most moved on after a few days. A few stayed longer. None of them had news of Astoria." She paused. "But the signal reaches. You're proof of that. If they're out there and they have a radio, they might hear it." This was not hope she was offering me. It was logistics. The signal exists. Radios exist. The probability is non-zero. It was the most honest form of comfort available, and I received it as such. Liam spoke for the first time. "The group that came through yesterday, 4 of them heading north. They said the infected are massing south of Tillamook Head. Something's drawing them. We should talk about that." "Tomorrow," Vivian said. "If they mass, they push north. That puts them on the headland approach within a week." "Tomorrow," Vivian repeated, and her tone made it clear that the schedule of urgency was hers to set. Liam looked at me as if to recruit an ally, but I had no standing here and no information yet, so I kept my expression neutral. Vivian showed me to a space on the second floor where I could sleep. The room had been a bedroom once. There were still curtain rods above the windows and nail holes where pictures had hung. But now it contained only a sleeping pad, a candle, and a bucket.
From the window, I could see the signal fire below, burning steadily, and beyond it, the vast black nothing of the Pacific Ocean stretching to the edge of perception. I didn't sleep for a long time.
I lay in the dark and listened to the lighthouse. It made sounds, old sounds, structural sounds, the kind of language that buildings speak when they've been standing in weather for 100 years. Creaks and ticks and the low, barely audible hum of wind passing over the tower. And underneath these, the faint repetition of Vivian's voice on the radio below, reading her message into the night. This is Cape Morrow Light. Survivors present. Fresh water available. Over and over, patient as a heartbeat. I woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices. Downstairs, Vivian and Liam were arguing. Not shouting. The collapse teaches you to argue quietly, because volume is a luxury the same way noise is a weapon. But the tension was sharp enough to cut through the floor. I dressed quickly and descended the stairs. "Tell him," Liam said when he saw me. "Tell him what you told me." Vivian was standing by the radio desk. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than one bad night. "The signal isn't just going out," she said. "It's being answered." She showed me. On the marine band transceiver, a frequency I hadn't scanned the night before, there was a response signal. Not voice, data. A coded burst transmission that repeated at irregular intervals, always on the same frequency, always in the same pattern. It had started 3 days ago. Vivian had been monitoring it since. "What is it?" I asked. "I don't know. It's encrypted. Military format, I think. The burst structure looks like what the Coast Guard used for automated distress relays, but the encoding is different. Newer." "Military," Liam said. "Which means someone official is still out there. Which means they might be coming here. Which means we need to decide right now whether that's a good thing or a very bad thing." I understood his concern. The military's role in the collapse had been ambiguous at best. In the early weeks, there had been organized response. Evacuations, quarantine zones, supply drops. But as the infection outpaced containment, the response had shifted from protective to punitive. I had personally witnessed the aftermath of a military operation near Salem where an entire neighborhood had been razed, not by infected, but by incendiary munitions dropped on a quarantine zone that had been deemed unrecoverable. The logic was sound in the brutal arithmetic of pandemic containment. The morality was something else entirely. And the stories that circulated among survivors about what had happened in the larger quarantine zones, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, were worse than anything the infected themselves had done. "It could be automated," I said. "A relay station responding to your signal by protocol. No humans involved." "That's possible," Vivian acknowledged. "But the intervals aren't regular. An automated system would repeat on a fixed schedule. This one varies. 12 minutes, then 9, then 15, then 11. That's a human pattern." "Or a degrading system," I suggested. "Or a human pattern," she repeated. Rose appeared at the base of the stairs. I hadn't heard her come down. She stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she spoke. Her voice was small and rough, as if her vocal cords had atrophied from disuse. "They came to the last place, too," she said. "The people who sent signals like that. They came, and they took everyone." We all looked at her. She looked at the floor. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I was at a shelter, near Coos Bay. 30 of us. Someone had a radio. They made contact with someone military. A week later, a helicopter came. They said they were relocating us to a safe zone. They put us in trucks." She stopped. Her hands were shaking. "I got out.
I got away before the trucks left. The others didn't. Where were the trucks going? Vivian asked. I don't know.
But I heard the soldiers talking. They said intake and processing, and they said a word I didn't understand. Reclamation. They called it a reclamation facility. The room was silent except for the wind against the windows and the faint hiss of the radio. Liam's face had hardened into the expression of a man who feels vindicated by bad news, which is its own kind of ugliness. Vivian's expression was harder to read. She was thinking, running the information through whatever analytical framework a marine biologist uses to evaluate data, looking for the pattern underneath the anecdote. Rose, Vivian said carefully, how long ago was this? Before I came here. A long time. Maybe August. And you've been here since? Rose nodded. I walked. It took a long time. I found this place and it was empty, and I stayed. So Rose had been here first. Rose had been living in the lighthouse alone before Vivian arrived, before the signal began. This changed my understanding of the compound's social geometry in ways I was still processing. You never said any of this before, Liam said, and there was an accusation in his tone that Vivian shut down with a look. She's saying it now, Vivian said. That's what matters. I spent the rest of that morning on the tower. 147 steps. Ellie's count was accurate, which made me smile and then made me ache. The lantern room at the top was intact, its massive Fresnel lens still in place, a cathedral of glass and brass that caught the gray coastal light and broke it into rainbows on the walls. The lens hadn't been operational in years, but the mechanism that rotated it was still present, and I could see that someone, Vivian presumably, had cleaned and oiled the gears. Whether she intended to restore it or simply couldn't bear to see a precision instrument neglected, I didn't know. From the top, I could see the full geography of our situation. The headland was a natural fortress. 3 sides dropped sharply to the ocean, with cliffs ranging from 40 to 70 feet, impassable from below. The only approach was from the south, where the concrete stairs and the path from the coast road provided the single access point. This was the vulnerability, but it was also the control point. With the chain-link gate and the narrow approach, a small number of defenders could hold the headland against a significant number of infected, as long as they didn't arrive in overwhelming force. But Liam's warning about the massing near Tillamook Head was concerning. I had seen herd behavior in infected before, the way they aggregated around stimuli, usually sound, sometimes light, accumulating in one location until the critical mass became a migration. When they migrated, they moved like water, following the path of least resistance, flowing around obstacles and pooling in low points. The coast road was a low point. The headland approach was the path of least resistance. If a herd moved north along the coast, Cape Morrow would be directly in its path, and the signal fire and the radio broadcast were exactly the kind of persistent stimuli that attracted aggregation. The signal that kept us alive was also the signal that could kill us. I brought this analysis to Vivian that afternoon. She received it with the calm of someone who had already considered it. I know, she said. I've always known. The fire and the broadcast are risks. Everything that makes us findable to survivors makes us findable to infected. That's the math. I chose to be findable anyway. And now? I asked. With the military signal? That's a different variable. I'm still calculating. I respected her process, but I also recognized that calculation without decision is just a sophisticated form of paralysis, and we were on a clock. The military signal continued through the day, its irregular bursts arriving like a heartbeat with arrhythmia. Vivian recorded each one, noting the timestamp and duration, trying to find a pattern in the intervals that might reveal whether it was human or automated. Liam wanted to shut down our broadcast entirely. Go dark, eliminate the signal, become invisible. I understood the impulse, but I also knew what it would cost. The broadcast was the only reason anyone came to Cape Morrow. It was the only reason I was here. And if Sarah and Ellie were out there with a radio, it was the only thread by which they might find their way to me. I said this to Liam directly, not as an argument, but as a fact. He looked at me for a long time and then said, "I had a brother. In Portland. He's gone. I know he's gone because I saw Portland. At some point, Daniel, the search becomes the thing that's killing you." He said it without cruelty, and I heard in his voice the particular authority of a man who had already made the surrender he was recommending to me. He had stopped searching. He had absorbed the loss and converted it into the hard pragmatism that now defined his survival strategy. I couldn't condemn him for it. I also couldn't follow him. That night I took a shift monitoring the radio while Vivian slept. The broadcast continued on its automated cycle. Vivian had shown me how she had rigged the ham transceiver with a simple timer that triggered playback of her recorded message at 90-second intervals, so the signal could maintain itself through the night without requiring her constant presence. My job was to watch for incoming communications, both the military burst signal and any voice transmissions from survivors. The military signal came 3 times during my watch. I logged the intervals: 14 minutes, 7 minutes, 22 minutes. No pattern I could discern. But during my 3rd hour of monitoring, something else happened. A voice broke through on the ham frequency, not responding to our broadcast, but transmitting on a nearby channel, close enough that it bled through. A man's voice, strained and breathless, saying, "If anyone can hear this, we are 40 people at the Tillamook Head trailhead. We cannot hold. Repeat, we cannot hold. Infected coming from the south in numbers we've never..." Then static. Then nothing. 40 people. The trailhead was roughly 15 miles south of us. If they couldn't hold, and if the infected overran them, those infected plus whatever additional numbers they accumulated along the way would flow north along the coast road like water through a channel, arriving at Cape Morrow within days. Maybe sooner. The dead don't rest. The dead don't stop to sleep or eat or doubt. They just move, steadily, relentlessly, drawn by whatever sensory input reaches them, until they reach the source, or until the source goes silent. I woke Vivian. I woke Liam. I woke Rose. I told them what I had heard. In the candlelight, with the wind shaking the old windows and the sea roaring below the cliffs, we sat in a circle, like people have sat in circles since the beginning of the species, facing a threat too large for any individual to solve. And we talked about what to do. Liam's position was clear. Shut down the broadcast, extinguish the signal fire, go dark, and prepare defensive positions at the gate. Survive through invisibility. Let the herd pass by, drawn onward by other stimuli, and emerge when it was safe. Vivian's position was the opposite. Increase the broadcast, transmit on wider frequencies, try to reach the 40 people at Tillamook Head and guide them north to the Lighthouse, where the defensible terrain could protect all of us if we organized properly. Use the signal not as a lure, but as a lifeline. Accept the risk of visibility in exchange for the strength of numbers. Rose said nothing for a long time, and when she did speak, she said the thing that none of us wanted to hear. "The soldiers will come regardless. They're already tracking the signal. Going dark now won't change that. They've already triangulated. It's what they do." "You don't know that," Liam said. "I know what happened before. I know how they found us at Coos Bay." "They found us because we broadcast. They were listening. They're always listening." This introduced a third variable into the calculus that I hadn't fully reckoned with. It wasn't just a choice between safety and generosity, between hiding and helping. It was a choice made under the shadow of a third party whose intentions we couldn't determine and whose capabilities we couldn't assess. The military, or whatever organized remnant was sending that burst signal, represented a force that could be salvation or destruction, and we had no way to know which until it arrived. I spoke last because I was the newest and because I needed time to think. What I said was this: we have 2 or 3 days before the herd reaches us, if the transmission from Tillamook Head was accurate. We have an unknown amount of time before whatever is sending the military signal acts on our location. And we have a broadcast that is the only thing connecting us to anyone else who's still alive out there. I paused. I don't think we can make this decision based on safety alone. Safety isn't available. Every option is dangerous. The question is which danger we choose, and what that choice says about who we're deciding to be. It was the kind of statement that sounds more decisive than it is. I was afraid. I wanted to go dark and hide and wait for the threat to pass, the way I had waited in the surf outside the sea cave, silent and cold, letting the danger exist beside me without engaging it. But I also knew that hiding was what I had been doing for months. Hiding inside my search for Sarah and Ellie. Hiding inside the miles. Hiding inside the movement itself. And that if there were 40 people 15 miles south of us who might live if we acted and might die if we didn't, then the arithmetic of compassion demanded something I was not sure I could afford. We argued through the night, not always productively. Liam accused Vivian of recklessness, of treating the lighthouse like a monument to her own purpose rather than a survival resource. Vivian accused Liam of a cowardice he dressed up as pragmatism. I mediated poorly, lacking the authority or the information to resolve the fundamental disagreement, which was not really about tactics but about philosophy. Whether survival was a project of contraction or expansion. Whether you lived by getting smaller or by getting larger. Both strategies had evidence in their favor. Both had killed people. Near dawn, Rose settled it. She went to the radio, sat down, and began transmitting. Not Vivian's recorded message, but her own voice, live, unscripted, speaking directly to anyone who could hear. This is Cape Morrow Light. If you're at Tillamook Head, listen to me. The coast road north is passable for the next 12 miles. Stay on the beach when the road fails. There is a sea cave at mile marker 26. Avoid it. There are infected inside. The headland approach is from the south. Concrete stairs built into the bluff. The gate is unlocked. We have water. We have walls. Come now. Come before the tide turns. She transmitted this 3 times, then turned off the radio and looked at us with an expression that I can only describe as the face of someone who has been silent for so long that the act of speaking has become a kind of violence against her own protective instinct. "That's done now," she said. "Help me build up the fire." The next 36 hours were the most concentrated period of labor and terror I have experienced since the collapse began. We fortified. Vivian directed the work with the organizational clarity that I imagined she had once brought to research projects. Every task assigned, every resource inventoried, every contingency discussed. We reinforced the chain-link gate with additional wire and scavenged lumber. We created a secondary barrier 50 feet behind it, using overturned benches and metal sheeting from a maintenance shed. We stockpiled rocks, simple, primitive, effective, along the cliff edge above the approach stairs, where they could be dropped on anything attempting to climb. We filled every container we had with fresh water from the rain catchment system, anticipating the possibility of a siege. Liam worked without speaking, his objection recorded but overridden, his body committed to the collective decision even as his mind remained unconvinced. I respected this more than I would have respected either enthusiastic compliance or sullen refusal. He did the work because the work needed doing, and he saved his energy for the doing rather than wasting it on the argument. I noted that his shotgun, now reassembled, was always within arm's reach. By the second afternoon, the first survivors from the south began to arrive. They came in small groups, staggering up the concrete stairs with the hollow-eyed desperation I recognized because I had worn it myself. 2 men and a woman, all in their 40s, carrying almost nothing. Then a family, a couple with 2 children, a boy of perhaps 8 and a girl younger still, both silent in the way that children become when sustained fear replaces the normal architecture of their emotional lives. Then 3 more singles, arriving separately over the course of 2 hours, each having heard Rose's broadcast and followed her directions. 9 new people by nightfall. 9 mouths, 9 bodies, 9 sets of needs and fears and histories, compressed into the small compound of the Cape Morrow Lighthouse. Vivian processed them with efficiency and compassion. Water first, then food, then space assignment, then skills inventory. One of the men had been a paramedic. One of the women had military reserve training. The rest were ordinary people with ordinary skills made extraordinary by context. A man who could cook with minimal resources. A woman who knew carpentry. A teenager in the family group who turned out to have an almost supernatural ability to hear infected approaching before anyone else could detect them. The teenager's name was Marcus, and his gift became critical sooner than any of us expected. On the second night after the new arrivals, with 17 people now occupying the lighthouse compound, Marcus came to me where I was standing watch at the gate and said quietly, "They're here." I listened. I heard nothing but wind and surf. "South," Marcus said. "On the road, a lot of them." I still heard nothing, but I had learned in the preceding hours to trust Marcus's ears over my own, so I raised the alarm. Vivian mobilized the compound. Everyone who could stand took a position. Liam was at the gate with his shotgun. I was beside him with my revolver and my hatchet. The others were positioned along the defensive lines according to the plan Vivian had devised. Those with weapons at the front, those with rocks and improvised tools behind them, the children and Rose in the lighthouse tower itself, which could be sealed from inside. 10 minutes after Marcus's warning, I heard them. The sound preceded the sight by several minutes. A collective shuffling, dragging, moaning that rose from the darkness below the bluff like something being exhaled from the earth. Not dozens, hundreds. The herd from the south, driven by whatever stimulus had set it in motion, flowing up the coast road and pooling at the base of the headland where the approach stairs began. The first of them appeared in the firelight at the bottom of the stairs. A woman in what had once been a nurse's uniform, her face a ruin, her movements the characteristic stiff-jointed lurch that I had seen 1,000 times and that still, every single time, sent a spike of primal terror through my nervous system. Behind her, more. An endless more. They filled the stairway, each one pushing the one ahead upward, gravity and momentum working against them, but numbers working in their favor. The stairs were narrow enough that only 2 or 3 could ascend abreast, and this bottleneck was our salvation, because it transformed the herd from an overwhelming force into a manageable stream. Liam fired first. The shotgun blast in the confined space of the headland was enormous, and the first 2 infected on the stairs were thrown backward into those behind them, creating a momentary cascade of falling bodies. But the ones behind simply climbed over the fallen and kept coming, and Liam pumped and fired again and again, and then he was out and reloading, and in the interval between his shots, 3 infected reached the gate. The chain link held. This was the moment on which everything depended, and it held. The infected pressed against it, their hands pushing through the diamond-shaped gaps in the mesh, grasping at air, and Liam and I and the paramedic whose name was David stood at the gate and used bladed weapons through the mesh, striking at heads and hands and anything that pressed close enough to reach. It was brutal work. It was not combat in any meaningful sense. There was no strategy, no skill, only endurance and the willingness to keep swinging when your arms burned and your hands cramped and the faces on the other side of the fence blurred into a single, continuous expression of mindless hunger. We held the gate for 2 hours. Others rotated in when we rotated out, gasping, bloodied, shaking. The rocks from the cliff edge proved effective. Several people stationed above the approach stairs dropped stones on the ascending infected, breaking the flow and creating obstacles that slowed the upward pressure. The bottleneck of the stairs saved us. If the headland had been approachable on a broad front, we would have been overrun in minutes. But the geography that made Cape Morrow a lighthouse station, its isolation, its elevation, its limited access, also made it a fortress. And by dawn, the herd had thinned enough that the pressure on the gate ceased, and the remaining infected at the base of the stairs began to drift, their attention captured by some other stimulus, a sound, a light, something to the north, and they wandered away along the beach in ones and twos until the stairs were empty and the approach was clear. We had survived. 17 people, one night, against a herd of what we estimated at 300 to 400 infected. No one had been bitten. No one had been lost. The cost was exhaustion, a quantity of ammunition we couldn't replace, and a psychological toll that manifested differently in each person. Some wept. Some went silent. Some couldn't stop talking, repeating the details of the night to anyone who would listen, processing the trauma through narration, the way the body processes a toxin through fever. I found Vivian on the tower. She was sitting with her back against the Fresnel lens, looking out at the gray ocean. And when I sat beside her, she said, "The signal brought them here." The survivors, yes. And the herd, the signal fire, the broadcast. They came because we were loud. Yes. So the signal saved 17 lives and nearly killed 17 lives. The same signal, the same frequency. I didn't have an answer for this because it wasn't a question. It was the fundamental paradox of her project, stated plainly. The act of reaching out is identical in form to the act of exposing yourself. The lighthouse cannot send its beam in only one direction. It illuminates everything, the ship and the reef, the survivor and the predator, the living and the dead. Vivian had always known this. She had chosen to broadcast anyway, and the night had proved both her hope and her fear correct, simultaneously, without resolving the contradiction. We spent the following day recovering, tending minor injuries, redistributing supplies among 17 people whose combined resources were barely adequate for 8. The arithmetic was harsh. We had perhaps 2 weeks of food at severe rationing. Water was sustainable if the rain continued, but the coast was entering a dry period, and the catchment barrels were already lower than Vivian liked. The compound could support this many people physically. There was space. But the social architecture was strained. 17 strangers sharing a space designed for a single lighthouse keeper. Under conditions of extreme stress, with fundamentally different ideas about what should happen next. And the military signal continued. It came 3 more times during the day, always on the same frequency, always in the same encrypted burst format. Vivian had made progress on analyzing the intervals and believed she had identified a pattern. The bursts were not random, but were adjusting in response to our transmissions, shortening when we broadcast and lengthening when we went silent. This suggested active monitoring. Someone was listening to us and modulating their response accordingly. Whether this was automated adaptive technology or a human operator making real-time adjustments, we couldn't determine. Rose's warning echoed in my mind. They found us because we broadcast,
They were listening. They're always listening.
On the third day after the herd attack, I made a decision that surprised even me. I told Vivian I was going to try to find the source of the military signal. The burst transmissions, based on signal strength and the directional antenna that Vivian had constructed from salvaged materials, appeared to be coming from somewhere to the north. Not far north, perhaps 20 to 30 miles, which put it in the vicinity of Cannon Beach or Ecola State Park, areas I hadn't scouted, but that my knowledge of coastal geography told me contained several potential sites for a military installation. There was an old Coast Guard communications relay station near Ecola Point that had been decommissioned but not demolished. If any remnant military operation was using pre-existing coastal infrastructure, that station would be a logical location. Vivian argued against it. Liam, surprisingly, argued for it. "Better to know," he said. "Whatever's out there, it's coming for us whether we look for it or not. At least this way we see it first." Rose said nothing, but when I was packing my supplies for the journey, she came to me and pressed something into my hand. A compass. Old, brass, the kind you find in antique stores.
"It was here when I arrived," she said. "In the keeper's desk. I think it belonged to the Lighthouse."
She paused.
"Come back."
"I will."
"People say that."
"I know. I'm saying it anyway." I left at dawn on a Thursday. I knew it was Thursday because Vivian kept a calendar, another act of structural maintenance that I found both admirable and heartbreaking. This insistence on marking days in a world that no longer organized itself by the week. I took 3 days of food, my weapons, the handheld radio, and Rose's compass. I descended the headland stairs, passed through the debris of the herd's assault, the broken bodies of infected scattered across the beach and the lower approach, already being worked on by seabirds, and turned north. The coastline between Cape Morrow and Cannon Beach was some of the most dramatic terrain in Oregon. Soaring headlands, sea stacks rising from the surf like stone monuments, beaches that stretched in long crescents between rocky points. It was also some of the most dangerous terrain I had traversed since the collapse began. The highway through this section had been built with tunnels and bridges that were natural choke points, and several of these had been destroyed, either by military demolition or by the same erosion that eventually claims all coastal infrastructure. I was forced onto the beach repeatedly, navigating tidal zones and rock formations that required climbing skills I possessed only marginally. I saw evidence of survivors throughout. Campsites, some recent. Messages scratched into driftwood or spray-painted on rock faces. Names, dates, directions, warnings. Don't drink the water in Arch Cape. Bridge out at Hug Point. Use beach at low tide. TM plus RM alive. 11:14, heading north. I read every message, looking for Sarah's handwriting, looking for Ellie's name, knowing I wouldn't find them and looking anyway, because the search was the structure and the structure was the self. I reached the vicinity of Ecola Point on the second day. The old Coast Guard relay station was exactly where my mental map placed it. A small concrete building on a promontory overlooking the ocean, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. From a distance, it looked abandoned. No vehicles, no movement, no visible antenna or communications equipment. But as I observed from a concealed position in the tree line for 2 hours, I noticed details that contradicted the appearance of abandonment. The fence was intact, not just standing, but maintained, with fresh patches where the wire had been repaired. The building's single visible door was reinforced with what looked like steel plate bolted over the original frame. And on the roof, partially concealed by a tarp that matched the gray of the concrete, I could see the outline of a satellite communications array, that was far more sophisticated than anything a decommissioned relay station would have retained. Someone was here. Someone with resources and technical capability well beyond what any civilian survivor group possessed. I watched for another hour before I saw movement. A figure emerged from the building, crossed to the fence perimeter, checked several points along its length, and returned inside. The figure was wearing military fatigues. The figure was carrying an automatic weapon. The whole procedure took less than 5 minutes and was performed with the efficiency of a routine rather than the alertness of someone in danger. Whoever was in that building did not feel threatened. They felt secure. They felt organized. They felt like they belonged there. I retreated into the tree line and considered my options. I could approach openly, identifying myself as a civilian survivor and requesting information. This was the most direct path, and also the most dangerous. Rose's account of Coos Bay suggested that military contact had not gone well for survivors, and an armed soldier in a fortified position had every advantage over a man with a hatchet and a revolver. I could observe longer, gathering more information before making a decision. Or I could return to Cape Morrow and report what I had found, letting the group decide collectively. What I actually did was none of these things. What I actually did was sit in the tree line for 6 hours, paralyzed by a fear I couldn't name, watching the building the way an animal watches a trap, recognizing the danger, recognizing the bait, unable to either retreat or advance because both options carried unacceptable risk. It was during this paralysis that the door opened again and 2 figures emerged. One was the soldier I had seen before. The other was a civilian, a woman, thin, wearing clothes that were too large for her, moving with the tentative steps of someone who has been indoors for a long time and finds the outside world overwhelming. The soldier walked her to the fence, opened a gate I hadn't noticed before, and gestured outward. The woman stepped through the gate onto the open ground beyond the perimeter. She stood there, blinking, as if unsure what to do. The soldier closed the gate behind her, returned to the building, and shut the reinforced door. The woman had been released, or expelled, or something else. She stood outside the fence for several minutes, hugging herself, turning slowly as if trying to orient herself in a landscape she didn't recognize. Then she began walking. Not toward me, south, toward the beach, with the aimless drift of someone who has no destination. I followed her. I caught up with her on the beach a quarter mile from the station. When I called out, she startled so violently that she fell, and I had to approach with my hands raised and my voice low, the way you approach a traumatized animal, with patience and no sudden movements. She told me her name was Catherine. She told me she had been at the relay station for 3 weeks. She told me things that I need to record here because they matter. The station was operated by a military remnant. Not a full unit, but a fragment of one. 7 soldiers and 2 communications specialists who had been assigned to a coastal monitoring mission before the collapse, and had continued that mission autonomously after the chain of command dissolved. Their purpose was surveillance. They monitored radio signals along the entire Oregon and Washington coast, tracking survivor groups, recording locations, assessing numbers and resources. They were building a map of human survival, not to help the survivors, but to catalog them for a command structure that Catherine believed no longer existed, but that the soldiers still served out of institutional habit or genuine belief. The burst signal they were sending to Cape Morrow was not a response, but a tag, a tracking marker. They had identified Vivian's broadcast, triangulated its location, and tagged it in their system as a survivor node. They did this with every broadcast they detected. They had done it with the group at Coos Bay. They had done it with a community near Florence. They had done it with a fishing village near Westport. What happened after the tagging, Catherine didn't know with certainty. She knew that some tagged locations had been visited by other military elements, helicopters, vehicles, personnel arriving to assess and relocate. She knew that the relocations were not voluntary. She knew the word reclamation was used, and she knew it was connected to a facility somewhere inland, whose purpose and location the soldiers at the relay station did not share with the civilians they processed. Catherine had been found by a patrol, brought to the station, held for 3 weeks while they determined she had no useful intelligence, and released. Released into a hostile landscape with no supplies, no weapons, and no direction. This was, apparently, standard procedure for civilians who were deemed neither useful nor threatening. They were simply put outside the fence and allowed to become the environment's problem. I brought Catherine back to Cape Morrow. The journey took a day and a half, slowed by her physical weakness and by the detours necessary to avoid a small group of infected that had taken up residence near Hug Point. I fed her from my diminishing supplies and let her rest when she needed to rest, and in the long, quiet hours of walking, I told her about the lighthouse and the people there, because she needed to know that there was still something worth walking toward. When we arrived, Vivian received Catherine with the same efficient compassion she had shown every arrival. Water, food, space, questions later. But when later came, and Catherine told her story to the assembled group, the effect was seismic. 17 people, now 18, sitting in the keeper's quarters of an old lighthouse, learning that the signal they had relied on for safety had also painted a target on their location for a military apparatus whose intentions ranged from ambiguous to alarming. The argument that followed was the most difficult collective conversation I have ever participated in. It lasted most of the night, and it fractured along lines I should have predicted. Some wanted to shut down the broadcast immediately, go dark, disperse into the landscape. Some wanted to fortify and prepare for military contact, treating it as an inevitability to be managed rather than a threat to be avoided. Some wanted to transmit a new message, not a survivor signal, but a warning, broadcasting to other groups what Catherine had told us about the tagging and the relocations. And some, including me, were caught between all of these positions, unable to commit to any single course of action because every option required accepting a loss I wasn't prepared to accept. If we went dark, the broadcast that might lead Sarah and Ellie to me would cease. If we stayed loud, we invited both rescue and predation. If we dispersed, the community that had formed, fragile, accidental but real, would dissolve, and the loneliest months of my life had already taught me what solitude costs. If we stayed, we became a target for forces we couldn't match. Vivian made the decision. Not by authority. She had no formal authority, and the group would not have accepted an autocratic decree. But by action. The way Rose had made the earlier decision by sitting down at the radio and transmitting. Vivian went to the radio desk, adjusted the frequency, and began recording a new message. Not the old survivor signal. Something different. Something that would change the landscape of the coast. This is Cape Morrow Light. To all survivors receiving this transmission, be advised, military remnant forces are operating along the Oregon coast, monitoring survivor radio signals and tracking broadcasting locations. Survivor groups have been forcibly relocated to unknown facilities under the designation reclamation. If you are broadcasting, you are being tracked. Take precautions. Protect your people. This message will repeat. She looked at me as she pressed the transmit button. The lighthouse warns of danger. That's what it's for. The message went out. It went out again and again, cycling through the night, replacing the old survivor signal with a warning that would reach anyone within the broadcast radius. A radius that Vivian estimated at roughly 60 miles, depending on atmospheric conditions and terrain. It would reach the military station at Ikola Point. They would hear it. They would know that their surveillance operation had been exposed by their own subject. And they would respond. We prepared for that response the way you prepare for weather you cannot prevent, by securing what can be secured and accepting what cannot. Liam organized defensive positions with the competence of someone who has thought about this more than he has admitted. David, the paramedic, assembled a medical station from our limited supplies. The mother of the two children, whose name was Helen, moved her family into the tower itself, the most defensible point in the compound. Marcus, with his extraordinary hearing, took a permanent watch position at the top of the stairs. I did something private. I took the handheld radio, and I climbed to the lantern room, and I sat among the prismatic glass of the Fresnel lens, and I transmitted on the frequency that Sarah and I had agreed upon years ago, during one of those conversations about emergency preparedness that had seemed theoretical and faintly ridiculous at the time. It was a family frequency, a specific channel we had programmed into our home radios for use in earthquakes or storms. I had transmitted on it before, many times, never receiving a response. I transmitted again now, not because I expected an answer, but because the act itself was the structure, and the structure was the self. Sarah, Ellie, this is Daniel. I'm at the Cape Morrow Lighthouse on the Oregon coast. I'm alive. I'm looking for you. If you can hear this, come to the light. I'll keep it burning. Static. Wind. The vast, indifferent hiss of a frequency with no one on the other end. I sat with it. I let the silence be what it was. Then I went back down the 147 stairs, and I helped Vivian build up the signal fire for the night, because the light was the mission, and the mission was the meaning, and meaning was the only thing left that the dead couldn't take. 3 days passed. The military response did not come as we expected. There were no helicopters, no vehicles, no armed soldiers at our gate. Instead, something else happened. The burst signal from Ikola Point stopped. Completely. On the morning of the second day after Vivian's warning broadcast, the encrypted transmissions that had been arriving at irregular intervals simply ceased. Vivian monitored the frequency for 48 hours and heard nothing. Whatever operation had been running at the relay station had gone silent. I didn't know what this meant. Neither did Vivian. It could mean they had withdrawn, intimidated, or inconvenienced by the exposure of their surveillance. It could mean they had shifted to a different frequency we weren't monitoring. It could mean they were moving, packing up the relay station and approaching by ground, quietly, without the electronic announcement of their encrypted chatter. The absence of information was not the same as the absence of threat, and we maintained our defensive posture even as the days grew calm and the coast settled into one of those periods of false peace that I had learned to distrust. On the 5th day after the warning broadcast, something happened that I still cannot fully explain. I was on watch at the gate in the early morning, the gray pre-dawn light just beginning to separate the ocean from the sky, when I heard the radio in the keeper's quarters cycling through Vivian's warning message. It reached the end of its loop, and in the brief silence before it repeated, another sound came through the speaker. Not the military burst signal. Not static. A voice. A girl's voice. It said, "Dad?" One word. Then static reclaimed the frequency, and the warning message began again, and the moment was gone. I stood at the gate with my hands gripping the chain link, and my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. And I did not move for a long time, because I was afraid that if I moved, the moment would become real. And if it became real, it could also become false. And I could not survive it being false. I went to the radio, I switched to the family frequency. I transmitted. Ellie? Ellie, is that you? This is Dad. Can you hear me? Nothing. Static. The patient, indifferent hiss. I transmitted again and again. For an hour I sat at that radio and spoke my daughter's name into the void. And the void said nothing back. And when Vivian found me there, she put her hand on my shoulder and said nothing either. Because there was nothing to say that would help, and she was wise enough to know it. But I had heard it. I had heard it. One word in a voice that I knew the way I knew my own breathing, and it had come from the north. From somewhere up the coast, past the relay station, past Cannon Beach, past Seaside, toward Astoria, where Sarah's mother lived, and where Sarah and Ellie had been when the world ended. Vivian saw it in my face before I said it. You're leaving. I have to. I know. She didn't argue. She didn't offer the gentle pragmatism that Liam would have offered. The reminder that one word on a degraded frequency could be anything. Interference, imagination, a phantom assembled by a desperate mind from random noise. She simply said, "Take the handheld. Stay on our frequency. If you find them, bring them here. And if the military comes, then we'll deal with it. We've dealt with worse. You've dealt with different. Worse might still be coming. Then it's coming whether you're here or not. Go find your family, Daniel." I packed that morning. 3 days of food, water purification tablets, my weapons, the radio, Rose's compass. The group gathered to see me off, and I was struck by how quickly these strangers had become people whose faces I would carry with me. Vivian with her calm authority, Liam with his reluctant courage, Rose with her hard-won voice, David with his steady hands, Marcus with his impossible ears, Helen holding her children close, Catherine still blinking at the light. 18 people I hadn't known 2 weeks ago, standing in the compound of a lighthouse on a cliff above the Pacific, waving as I descended the stairs. I stopped at the gate and looked back once. The lighthouse stood white against the gray sky, and as I watched, Vivian climbed to the lantern room and did something I hadn't seen her do before. She engaged the mechanism. The great Fresnel lens began to turn, slowly, catching the morning light and refracting it into a beam that swept the coast in a steady, ancient rhythm. Not the beam of a functioning navigational aid. There was no electric lamp behind the lens, only daylight. But the motion itself was the message. The lighthouse was keeping its light. The lighthouse was doing what it was built to do. I turned north. The coastal trail toward Cannon Beach was difficult but passable. I moved quickly, driven by a purpose more specific than any I had felt since the collapse began. The voice had been real. I would not permit myself to doubt it. Ellie was alive, and she was somewhere north of me, and she had heard Vivian's broadcast, or my transmission, or both. And she had spoken one word into a radio that connected us across the miles of broken coast like a thread through a labyrinth. I passed the Ecola Point relay station without stopping. It looked the same as before. Fence intact, door sealed, satellite array under its tarp. But there was no movement visible, and when I paused to listen on the military frequency, there was nothing. Silent. Whether abandoned or simply quiet, I couldn't tell, and I didn't have time to investigate. By evening, I had reached the outskirts of Cannon Beach. The town was in bad shape. Fire damage, flood damage, the general entropy of a place that had lost its human maintenance and was being reclaimed by the elements. Infected were present but scattered, wandering the streets in ones and twos. And I moved through the town using the back roads and residential lanes that I mapped in my head as I went. Staying below the sight lines, keeping quiet, keeping moving. On the far side of town, where the highway turned inland toward the tunnel that led to Seaside, I found something that stopped me. A message, spray-painted on the retaining wall of the highway in bright red letters, still vivid, clearly recent. Ellie M. Dad is coming. Go to the light. I stared at it. I had not written it. No one from Cape Morrow had written it. Someone else. Someone who had heard my transmission, or who knew my daughter, or who had encountered her, had left this message for her. Or for me. Or for both of us. Beneath the message, in smaller letters, a frequency number. And below that, 2 words. North. Hurry. I wrote down the frequency. I stood in the fading light of a ruined coastal town and looked north, toward Seaside, toward Astoria, toward the place where my family had last been alive. And I felt something that I had almost forgotten how to feel. Not hope. Hope is too simple a word for what lives in the chest of a man who has been searching for 7 months and has just found the first evidence that his search might not be futile. It was more like the feeling of a compass needle finally settling after a long, erratic spin. Direction. True north. The certainty that the next step and the step after that and every step after that was pointed towards something real. I powered on the handheld. I tuned to the new frequency. And I heard, faint but unmistakable, a signal. Not Vivian's broadcast, not the military encryption, something else entirely. A new voice, a man's voice, calm and measured, repeating a message I had never heard before. Mercer family, if you are receiving this, maintain course north. Waypoint established at the Astoria column. Survivors present. Signal will repeat. Someone knew my name. Someone was guiding me. Someone had established a waypoint at a landmark I knew well, the Astoria column, the hilltop tower overlooking the city where Sarah's mother lived, where I had taken Ellie to see the view, where on a clear day you could see the Columbia River meeting the Pacific and understand that all water eventually finds its way to the sea. I keyed the radio and transmitted. This is Daniel Mercer. I am receiving your signal. I am en route. Who is this? Static. The message repeated. No acknowledgement, no response to my transmission. Just the steady, patient loop of a signal pointing me north. I switched back to Cape Morrow's frequency and transmitted to Vivian. I found something. New signal. Someone knows my name. I'm continuing north toward Astoria. Will update when I can. Vivian's response came through clear and immediate, which meant she had been monitoring, waiting. Copy, Daniel. Be careful. The light is still burning. The light is still burning. I put the radio in my pack and I faced north, toward the dark coast and the unknown signal, and the voice that had said, Dad? In a frequency that connected me to every reason I had survived this long. The compass in my pocket pointed true. The lighthouse behind me swept its beam across the water. Somewhere ahead, past the ruins and the dead and the distance, my daughter's voice was waiting to say more than one word. I started walking. I am still walking. This is Daniel Mercer, and my journey is not over. The signal is leading me north, and I am following it the way a lighthouse follows its own beam. Not because I can see what's out there, but because sending the light is what I was built to do. If you find this record, know that Cape Morrow still stands. Know that Vivian Cross still keeps the light. Know that there are people on that cliff who will open the gate for you if you climb the stairs. And if your name is Sarah, or if your name is Ellie, know this. I heard you. I am coming. The light is still burning, and I am following every signal north until I find you, or until there are no more roads left to walk. And even then I will keep walking, because the search is the structure, and the structure is the self, and the self does not stop until the journey ends or the heart does. This is Cape Morrow. This is Daniel Mercer. The signal continues.